When we encounter the word hallucination, our minds often conjure images of something unreal, a figment of imagination that exists only within the confines of an individual's perception. We typically define it as the experience of seeing or hearing something that others cannot perceive. Imagine seeing a distinct shape, a vibrant color, or even a detailed figure standing in a room. To the person experiencing it, this vision can feel as utterly undeniable and concrete as the very chair they are sitting on. Yet, if no one else present can confirm its existence, we are quick to dismiss it as not real. This immediate dismissal, however, compels us to pause and ask a fundamental question. What precisely do we mean by real? The conventional understanding often dictates that reality is what can be shared and verified by consensus. If a majority of people can agree on the existence of something, then it is deemed real. But if we adhere strictly to this definition, then a vast spectrum of human experience would simply not qualify. Consider dreams, for instance. To the dreamer, the narrative, the emotions, the sensations within a dream are intensely, viscerally real. Yet they are fundamentally private. No one else can step into your dream and experience it with you. The same applies to private thoughts, the silent stream of consciousness that defines much of our waking lives. And what about pain? While medical science can observe the physiological responses to pain, no one can directly verify the specific headache you feel, or the precise image that arises in your mind's eye when you recall a memory. And yet, these experiences, dreams, thoughts, pain, undeniably exist for you, the individual experiencer. Their subjective reality is beyond doubt, even if their public accessibility is zero. This brings us to a crucial point where the very idea of hallucination forces us into a conceptual corner. Is a hallucination merely a falsehood, a deceptive trick of the mind, or an error in our sensory processing? Or is it something more profound, a distinct class of event within consciousness, utterly real in its happening, even if it remains inaccessible to others? To date, no scientific authority has definitively resolved this question with absolute certainty. This is because, at its core, it isn't merely a question of neurochemistry or biology, it is a deeper inquiry into the very nature of experience itself, into the subjective domain that science often struggles to quantify. The challenge lies in the fact that reality is not as straightforward as a simple show of hands or a majority vote. Consensus, while valuable for social cohesion and scientific repeatability, proves nothing about the intrinsic essence of a personal experience. As anyone who has dreamed can attest, the dream is profoundly real until the moment of waking breaks its spell. In the same vein, a hallucinatory vision is far from being a nothing. It is an authentic event within one's consciousness, possessing its own unique integrity and existence, a lived reality for the individual. Therefore, when we discuss hallucinations, we are not simply talking about mistakes or fabrications. We are brushing against the profound mystery of perception itself, the extraordinary capacity of the mind to project images, forms, and voices with a force and vividness comparable to that of the external world. And in this curious and often unsettling fact lies the first crack in our comfortable certainty about what we confidently label as real and unreal. It introduces a fluidity, a boundary blurring that challenges our default assumptions. What often transpires under the influence of certain psychedelic substances is something truly extraordinary. There is a shift in awareness, a heightened sense of being aware. In our everyday lives, our attention is typically directed outward, absorbed by the external world. When we look at a tree, our focus is on its branches and leaves, its texture and form. but we rarely notice the act of seeing through our eyes. When we listen to the notes of a violin, our attention is captivated by the melody and harmony, but we seldom notice the mechanics of our ears processing the sound. When our senses are functioning seamlessly, they tend to remain invisible, transparent, and largely unnoticed. It is only when something malfunctions, a persistent ringing in the ear or bothersome spots before the eyes, that we suddenly become acutely aware that these sensory organs are there, actively shaping and coloring our experience. Psychedelics profoundly magnify this effect. They subtly, yet powerfully, shift the focus of our attention away from the object being perceived and squarely onto the very process of perception itself. This constitutes a remarkable turning point because ordinarily we operate under the ingrained assumption that perception is simply a clear, unobstructed window onto an objective external world. However, once your vision alters, when colors begin to shimmer with an internal luminosity, when familiar forms seem to breathe and undulate, when sound starts to carry a palpable texture, you are compelled to ask, what exactly is it to see? What is it to hear? You become fascinated not only with the world you are perceiving, but with the very act of perceiving itself. In such moments, the senses appear to fold back upon themselves. The eye seems to look at the process of seeing, the ear listens to the act of hearing. This, fundamentally, is the genesis of self-exploration. For when you begin to notice awareness itself, when you observe the observer, you are turning inward towards the very root and ground of all experience. The psychedelic state, then, is not merely about experiencing peculiar patterns or hearing unusual sounds. It is a potent gateway into self-knowledge precisely because it compels you to examine the fundamental nature of consciousness. You become both the subject and the object, the observer watching the act of observation. And that deceptively simple shift is the seed of profound insight, often mirroring what advanced practitioners of meditation or mindfulness describe as meta-awareness or the witness consciousness. Once this pivotal shift occurs, when attention turns upon perception itself, you begin to notice peculiar alterations in the way the world presents itself. These are not, strictly speaking, the invention of entirely new objects or beings. You don't suddenly conjure up unicorns prancing through the room or castles floating in the air. Rather, ordinary things, the familiar furniture of your world, appear to transform in subtle but deeply curious ways. One might recall an experience of gazing at the mullions of a window, the vertical bars that divide the panes. There aren't suddenly more mullions than usual, nor are you exactly seeing double in the traditional sense. Yet, the very sequence of them, one beside the other, might suggest a doubling, as if the mind had woven an extra ghostly thread into the fabric of vision. When asked to hold up a single finger to test for double sight, one would still count just one. Yet beside it, a wisp of cigarette smoke might drift. That thin, curling wisp of smoke aligning itself with the finger could create a kind of ghostly twin. Was it truly there? In one empirical sense, no. In another, entirely subjective and experiential sense, absolutely yes. This is the very essence of psychedelic perception. The world becomes elastic, supple, and vibrantly alive. A solid wall, normally perceived as fixed and impenetrable stone, may suddenly appear to ripple like a curtain stirred by an unseen breeze. The intricate threads of a carpet, stared into long enough, might begin to wriggle and intertwine, as though each were a small, awakening creature, stirring from sleep. The world around you seems to breathe, the familiar grows unfamiliar, and paradoxically, the unfamiliar often feels strangely intimate, almost personal. And yet amidst all this profound flux and transformation, you generally retain a grounding sense that things are fundamentally as they ought to be. The chair remains recognizably a chair. The room is still undeniably the room. Nothing has truly vanished or ceased to exist. Everything is simply off-shifted, intensified, vibrating with a palpable life and energy that was always inherently there, but was seldom, if ever, consciously noticed. These deep alterations in perception inevitably provoke a fundamental question. If perception itself can be bent, stretched, made to shimmer, what is its true, unaltered shape? What is the right or true way to see the world? As these profound alterations unfold, another extraordinary discovery often comes to light. The senses are not as rigidly separate and compartmentalized as we have been taught to believe. Vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Under the influence of psychedelics, they frequently begin to blend, to cross over, revealing themselves as interdependent branches of one single underlying root. This phenomenon, known as synesthesia, is why individuals in such altered states often report hearing colors or seeing sound. A particular note of music may vividly glow with a specific hue, or a flicker of light may ring with a distinct tone. These are not merely fanciful metaphors or poetic expressions. They are lived, felt realities in that moment, a direct experience of sensory fusion. And in this context, they make a curious kind of sense, for all the senses are ultimately variations of one fundamental capacity, sensitivity itself. They are refinements of the same basic power of touch. Think of it this way: to see is, in essence, to be touched by light, as photons make contact with our retina. To hear is to be touched by vibrations in the air, translated by our eardrums. To taste and to smell are to be touched by subtle chemical dances upon the tongue and within the nose. At their most fundamental core, all senses are simply different ways in which the world presses itself upon us, and in which we, in turn, feel and register the world's presence. Ordinarily, we keep these sensory channels strictly compartmentalized. Vision is vision, sound is sound, taste is taste, each operating in its own silo. But under the influence of psychedelics, those partitions grow porous, permeable. The senses reveal their profound kinship, their shared origin. You begin to realize that perception is not 5 separate streams flowing independently, but a single, vast river flowing in different, interconnected currents. And once this deep interconnectedness is directly seen and felt, the old rigid divisions dissolve. You no longer ask whether you are exclusively seeing or hearing, but simply experiencing. The whole fabric of perception becomes a seamlessly woven unity, shimmering with countless distinct threads, yet all arising from the same fundamental loom of consciousness. It is a revelation that is both profoundly strange and startlingly obvious. All senses are, in essence, one unified sense, divided only for the convenience of our ordinary, analytical minds, and beautifully reunited when the mind steps back into its original undifferentiated wholeness. One of the most intriguing inquiries one can pose to oneself within the psychedelic state is to ask, what is the fundamental difference between this way of perceiving the world and my ordinary, everyday way? On the surface, everything still appears as it should. The chair is still undeniably a chair, the floor is still the floor, the walls still stand. But somehow it is all slightly skewed, subtly altered. It is the same, and yet distinctly not the same. You might compare it to donning a pair of tinted glasses. At first, the entire world is colored by the lens you've just put on. A pair of green shades makes every object appear green, while red lenses paint the entire landscape in crimson hues. But after a period of time, the mind naturally adapts. It begins to filter out this distortion, performing a kind of recalibration that restores a sense of balance. The initial green or red no longer overwhelms your perception. The world starts to look normal again, even though you have never removed the glasses. Now extend this analogy. Imagine putting on a unique glass for every single sense you possess. Sight, hearing, touch, taste and smell. Each sense becomes subtly colored, uniquely textured, distinctly flavored by an unseen filter, a filter that originates from within your own consciousness. The cumulative result is that everything appears funny. It is strange enough to constantly remind you that you are not simply passively receiving the world, but actively participating in the act of seeing, hearing, and feeling. This is what can be termed funny awareness, awareness that becomes utterly fascinated with itself, with its own mechanisms. Instead of being completely lost in the external objects the eyes present, or the sounds the ears deliver, you begin to notice the miracle of perception itself. Your mind starts to organize patterns, find meaning and connection in sensory data that, in an ordinary state, you might dismiss as mere accidents or random occurrences. Yet here they come alive, imbued with an apparent intentionality, a radiant significance. Thus, the profound difference experienced is not between what is real and what is unreal. Instead, it is the difference between an awareness that has forgotten its own creative role in perception and an awareness that has rediscovered it. Psychedelics, in this context, act as a tool to pull back the curtain, to reveal that perception is far from a passive reception of external stimuli. It is, in fact, a deeply creative and active process of interpretation and organization. This resonates strongly with modern cognitive science, which increasingly views perception not as a direct mirror of reality, but as a controlled hallucination or a best-guess inference generated by the brain based on incoming sensory data and prior expectations. From time to time, within the psychedelic state, there bursts forth an experience so overwhelming, so utterly radiant, that ordinary words can scarcely begin to contain or describe it. It is as if, for a brief, incandescent interval, you have placed your finger directly upon the very center of reality, upon the fundamental pulse of existence. The sensation is not merely visual or auditory, it is total, all-encompassing. The entire universe seems to reveal itself as an indestructible singular energy, a colossal, intricate dance of forces weaving in and out, expanding and contracting, playing endlessly without any discernible beginning or end. And in the midst of this breathtaking revelation, there arises a shocking, profound recognition. It is all you, and you had no idea. This does not imply that you are the only being in existence in an egoistic sense. Quite the opposite. It means that every center of life, every conscious creature, every flickering flame of consciousness is an expression of this very same radiant core, this ultimate source. Millions upon millions of distinct centers, yet all of them fundamentally one. In this extraordinary vision, you feel yourself as a kind of luminous center of light, filled with a pervasive joy, expansive beyond measure, roaring with laughter, vibrating with an overwhelming sense of universal love. It is like a tremendous yes, resounding through your entire being, echoing through every cell and fiber of your existence. For a few precious moments, everything around you glows with the unmistakable, undeniable presence of the divine, a whooping, singing, glorious boom of energy that emphatically declares, this is it, this is the truth. And though the sheer intensity of this experience does not last long, perhaps only for minutes, the afterglow lingers, profoundly transforming the subsequent perception of the world. The mundane world itself begins to shine with a reflected glory. Trees shimmer with an inner light, familiar faces glow with a newfound luminescence. Every ordinary object, from a teacup to a stone, hums with a subtle, palpable radiance. The direct vision eventually fades, but its indelible imprint remains, subtly reshaping your understanding. This luminous core is not some separate entity added to the world. It is the world, seen clearly without the usual filters and conceptual veils that our everyday consciousness employs. The psychedelic experience in this specific context simply rips away that veil, and for an instant you stand face to face with the infinite, boundless energy that was always there, breathing through you and as you. As this luminous intensity gradually subsides, there comes a gentle, often poignant return to the ordinary state of consciousness. At first, this return can sometimes feel like a loss, as though something grand, something ineffable, has slipped away from your grasp. However, if you look carefully, if you reflect upon the experience, you soon realize that ordinary life itself has been revealed in a completely new light. Everyday consciousness is no longer taken for granted. It is seen as an integral part of a larger, cosmic rhythm, a magnificent game of hide and seek between the manifest and the unmanifest. The dazzling, extraordinary vision and the plain, everyday world are not separate realms existing in opposition, but rather two interdependent sides of the very same coin. One implies the other. The extraordinary cannot exist or be appreciated without the ordinary, just as the soaring peaks of mountains require the grounding depths of valleys. So the return is not a descent into dullness or a regression to a lesser state. Instead, it is a crucial process of integration. You carry the memory, the felt sense of that radiant unity, and it colors the simplest, most mundane moments of your life. Washing dishes, walking through a crowded street, or even simply sitting in silence. All of these activities begin to hum with the very same pulse, the identical energy you once touched directly. And with that profound realization comes a curious, abiding peace. There is no longer a desperate need to cling to the peak vision or to resist the inevitable return to the ordinary. For the ordinary and the luminous are inextricably woven together, two threads in the same divine tapestry. And in truly knowing this, you settle into life with a deeper trust, an enhanced sense of ease, and a profound, often joyful acceptance. What begins to truly dawn in these states is a radical re-understanding of what we typically call opposites. They are not, in fact, truly opposed in a fundamental sense. Light only acquires meaning in relation to darkness, sound in relation to silence, life in relation to death. Each defines and necessitates the other. They are like the crest and trough of the same wave, integral parts of a unified whole. We tend to imagine these forces as locked in eternal combat, good against evil, self against other, pleasure against pain. But when viewed through this expanded lens of perception, they are not enemies, but rather indispensable partners in a vast, unfolding cosmic rhythm. The wave, after all, doesn't quarrel with itself. Its high point and its low point arrive together simultaneously as the very shape of the water's movement. A flower perfectly illustrates this principle. From a single unified center, petals gracefully unfold in every direction. You might conceptually pick two petals on opposite sides and label them opposed. Yet they are inherently joined, arising from the very same root, the same essential core. And here lies the curious, ultimate twist. When you truly see and feel that unity appears and expresses itself precisely through contrast, the entire distinction between what we label real perception and hallucination begins to lose its sharp edges, its rigid clarity. Both are experiences, both are undeniable events in consciousness, differing only in their level of public consensus and their adherence to our conventional expectations of reality. What we so readily dismiss as an illusion is often simply the mind showing us another, perhaps less familiar, side of the grand dance of existence. So perhaps what we categorize as a hallucination is not the contrary of reality, but simply another form of it, an altered, intensified, or rearranged configuration of perception. The very act of perception itself, whether it is of a tree outside your window or of a vivid vision within your mind's eye, ultimately remains just as inexplicable, just as miraculous. It challenges us to expand our definition of reality, to embrace the subjective, and to recognize the inherent creativity of consciousness itself.